Our first story begins at a time and place when miracles seemed few and far between. 1969 and the Vietnam War. Ever since he was a young boy, Ron Greenfield dreamed of flying.
My mom told me that from the time I could walk and talk, that's all I ever talked about was becoming a pilot.
Ron's love of aeronautics grew stronger over the years, but it wasn't until he was 17 that his dream finally came true. It was 1969 and the Vietnam War was in full swing. Ron had enlisted, gone through flight school, and begun piloting the new Cobra attack helicopter over the jungles of Vietnam.
I was flying what we call mortar patrol. Mortar patrol is where we keep aircraft up all the time and waiting for either the North Vietnamese Army or the Viet Cong to make mortar attacks on the U.S. troops. And once they fire the mortar, you could pinpoint it, and then you could quickly roll in and fire rockets on that spot.
And then, one day on a routine reconnaissance mission, his Cobra was hit by enemy gunfire. The helicopter was badly damaged and began a steep dive into the jungle below.
Apparently they hit my flight controls because I couldn't pull out of the dive. We probably hit the trees at about 200 to 250 miles an hour. It looked like the jungle just opened up. We went into it and it closed up and you couldn't even tell where we went in.
The Cobra literally came apart in the crash. Only the cockpit remained intact. Badly injured and bleeding, Ron managed to crawl out of the aircraft. But the excruciating pain made it impossible for him to move any farther, and ultimately, he passed out. Moments later, Ron's co-pilot, Terry McDonald, regained consciousness. Dazed and disoriented, Terry staggered towards a clearing in the trees to try to get his bearings. What happened next was a soldier's worst nightmare. In their haste, the enemy soldiers mistakenly left Ron for dead. Tragically, Terry McDonald would never be heard from again. Back at the wreckage, Ron remained unconscious. Finally, hours later, he awoke.
My flight helmet was shattered, which means I hit my head pretty hard. And you know how in the movies people kind of wake up and they say, you know, where am I? That's just how it was. I felt a real sharp pain in my left leg, and I looked down and the foot was laying flat even though my leg was straight. And I moved it and the foot flopped all the way over. I could see that half of my boot was gone and I was bleeding quite a bit. I knew I still had to stop this bleeding or I was going to die. I crawled over to some trees not far from the wreckage, and I put both legs up in the air against the tree. That's how I spent the night.
Weak, immobile, and losing more and more blood, Ron knew that it was only a matter of time before he would die or the enemy would return. The dramatic conclusion, when it's a miracle, continues. When helicopter pilot Ron Greenfield was shot down over enemy territory in Vietnam, he barely survived the crash. Miraculously, as he lay unconscious near the wreckage, enemy troops left him for dead. But his co-pilot wasn't as fortunate. When Ron finally came to, he realized that his leg was severely injured and he was losing a great deal of blood.
When I awoke, it was morning. I remember that it had been raining and trying to catch some raindrops with my mouth because I was thirsty. And then I began trying to think about how I was going to get out of there.
The situation seemed hopeless. 3 search and rescue missions for the 2 missing pilots had already failed. 1 helicopter had been shot down, killing 3 soldiers. A second was badly damaged, and a third ambushed when it landed. Unable to walk, Ron had no choice but to wait and pray. He desperately needed a miracle, and a few hours later his prayers were answered when a 4th Army helicopter finally spotted him.
The door gunner had seen a piece of wreckage, and that's what made him turn around. They sent a medic down on a cable. He hooked me up to a harness, and they hauled me out of there.
The next thing Ron knew, he was waking up in a MASH unit field hospital. But his ordeal was far from over.
It was 3 days before I gained consciousness. They did emergency surgery on me.
Can I get out of here anytime soon? Head up there?
Not my call, soldier. Tell you what, we're going to try to save your leg.
Sounds good.
They told me later they didn't know if I was going to make it.
Ron was shipped to Japan, where doctors performed additional surgery. But the prognosis wasn't good. Upon his return to the States, Ron would face a below-the-knee amputation.
I did not realize how seriously I was injured. I saw my flying career going away.
When Ron finally returned home, his doctors felt they could save his leg. But it wouldn't come without a price. The damaged limb had contracted an incurable bone infection, one which gave Ron constant pain.
It got progressively worse. A lot of that time was spent on crutches.
4 years and 16 painful surgeries later, Ron had had enough. He was transferred to a military hospital in Denver, Colorado, where 2 days later, his foot and lower calf were amputated. The results were immediate and miraculous.
By 10 o'clock, I wanted to get out of bed. And they said, nope, you got to stay in bed. Nobody gets out of bed after an amputation. I said, I feel fine. And the next day, I was out of my bed and walking on crutches around the hospital. Absolutely no pain. It was like this huge burden had been lifted.
This is what you're going to stand on in this socket, this area right here.
Ron's convalescence was amazing. He was fitted with an artificial limb, and as always, he was determined to defy the odds.
They always have to chase me out of therapy. I'd get down there and I'd spin until they'd force me to leave because I was determined I was going to be a good walker.
Excellent.
Soon, he was playing baseball, learning to ski, and running 10K races.
The attitude I developed was that the artificial leg was now part of me.
Eventually, Ron also came to terms with the fact that his flying career was over. But he still struggled with one unanswered question.
Always was asking God, why me? Why did you take my leg?
Then, in 1992, while on a business trip, Ron came across a newspaper article that helped answer that question. The article described 3-year-old Russian twins who'd been born with gangrene in their legs. Both boys had been turned over to an orphanage at infancy after their legs had been amputated.
It struck me, with all I've been through over the past, couple of decades, I could do something for these 2 kids that somebody with 2 good legs couldn't, because I know what they can do and what they can't do. I got on the phone to my wife and I pleaded with her that we should adopt these kids. I was reading an article in the paper.
Next, Ron contacted the Cradle of Hope Adoption Agency in Washington, D.C., and convinced them that they needed to look no further to place the Russian twins.
I told everyone, I said, if it takes more medical care than I thought, if it takes more mental care than I thought, I was going to bring these boys back and give them an opportunity.
That August, Ron and his wife boarded a plane to Moscow to bring the boys home.
I went to the orphanage there to see them, and they were sitting in a double stroller, and the best way to describe it is they were more beautiful than I even expected. On that plane back, I looked down at these two little guys, and they were sleeping, and it just, like a lightning bolt, hit me that that's the purpose. That's the purpose that God had. That's why I lost my leg. Because if I hadn't, I probably wouldn't have pursued those two little boys. It wouldn't have jumped out at me like it did.
Ron finally felt that he'd found the reason for all of his suffering. He knew that through his own experience, he could give his sons the confidence to rise above their disabilities.
They tell me often that they wish they could have real legs. And when they tell me that, I tell them, well, you know, we're dealt with what we're dealt with, and we just have to make the most of it.
Today, the boys are 12, and they both realize what a special gift their father has given them.
Dad adopted us because he felt like he can help us. Because if we have problems, he'll know what to do. My dad's my favorite person in the world because he has an artificial leg like I do, and he loves me a lot.
That love has made it possible for Max and Andy Greenfield to have the advantage of a full and active life.
It doesn't keep me from doing what I want to do. I can ride my skateboard or bike, and sometimes I ride my rollerblades, and I go swimming.
As Ron looks back on his experience, he is awed by the miracles that have touched his life.
It's been multitude of miracles. Surviving the crash, surviving the Vietnamese. And then I think the final miracle is Andy and Max. God put me at the right place at the right time, creating another miracle.
I hope that any of you considering adopting a child will find inspiration in Ron Greenfield's story. There are literally thousands and thousands of children with special needs waiting for someone who cares. Perhaps you too can make a difference in their lives.